The meeting to order. So if I could have everybody's attention. I think first thing I want to do is go around and have everybody introduce themselves. So we'll start with Representative Porter.
Good afternoon, Representative Gordon W. Porter from Indianapolis. Eric Gonzalez, House Democrat, Fiscal Analyst.
Senator Karen Talion, Senate District Number 4.
Deanna Owari, Deputy Budget Director, State Budget Agency.
Zach Jackson, Deputy Budget Director, State Budget Agency.
Liz Brown, Senate District 15, an alternate to this committee.
Jason Dudich, State Budget Director.
Ryan Mishler, District 9, the North Central Region.
Tim Brown, House District 41, Chairman Ways and Means.
Ben Tooley, House Republican Fiscal Analyst.
Bob Cherry, House District 53, alternate for the House Republicans.
Alicia Nafziger, House Republican Fiscal Analyst.
Thank you. All right, we're going to... Looking at the calendar here, we're going to take the forecast, economic forecast, revenue forecast, and the Medicaid forecast, and then we're going to take a 5-minute recess, and then we'll come back. So that being said, Mr. Jackson, if you'd like to go ahead and start us off.
All right, thank you. Just want to give a recap of where we are with the economic forecast. I'll kind of mostly talk about the state of Indiana. We kind of set the stage a little bit by what we're expecting at the national level. Basically, we see the economy being in pretty good shape right now, probably feel about as good about that and as confident about that as we have for a while. We say right at the top, we'll sustain above trend growth. It's probably a fairly low bar in terms of trend growth. Probably have about 2% real GDP growth in mind there. As far as the trend, so that's what we're talking about when we say above trend. So we do, see that, we've seen that in recent numbers, closer to 3%. We expect that to continue to be above 2%. Basically just a lot of strong fundamentals. Probably one of the big things that really has changed since the last time I was here, in particular back in April, is that really the global economy is performing better than what we've been seeing, whether it's emerging markets, Europe, a lot of places like that. So I think that makes us feel, a little more confident about, even what's going on in the U.S. has boosted export demand to some extent, lowered the dollar a little bit, and generally just makes us feel more confident. Now one big thing that I will point out, I pointed out to Mr. Wyman the other day, is that our current economic forecast does not include I'm sorry, I didn't move the slide ahead. Our forecast does not include the effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, just because this forecast, especially the U.S. forecast, was compiled 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it just wasn't included. We probably expect action on that pretty soon. So the forecast will be changing. That would be certainly at the U.S. level and for just about every state to some extent. We expect that to push forecasts up for GDP growth, wage growth, and that kind of thing. Now, exactly how much different categories will be impacted and different states get impacted, we haven't worked through that all yet. That'll be more in our January forecast. So I want to say that up front. I wish I had that today, but it's just kind of the timing of where we are. Just at kind of a baseline level there, we would expect it to raise real GDP growth by about 0.3 percentage points per year. So, if you're looking at 2.6% GDP growth, that would take it up to around 2.9% GDP growth, for example, in 2018. I do want to state that right up front. Just as, basically an upside risk to the forecast.
Representative Brown?
Is it okay we interrupt periodically during your is it okay if we interrupt
Absolutely, it's probably better that way.
Your point three related to the federal bill, how does that compare to other economists that are looking at this bill? Is that in the middle of the road? Is that a high prediction or a low prediction?
I think it's very middle of the road. It's in line with most, especially private forecasts I've seen. I've seen one or two higher, a couple lower, but it's very middle of the road, yes. So I'll move along. Again, half the time I probably get ahead of my slides anyway, but as far as changes since we last spoke, one of the big things, certainly in the state of Indiana is higher manufacturing employment. I relate some of that back to, kind of a previous point about just stronger global demand overall, really boosting, some demand for manufacturing. Some of that manufacturing is for, business equipment. We've seen some good growth in some areas of business fixed investment, just investments toward the future, basically, just reflecting some of the confidence that we're seeing in the national outlook. Another point that I know has arisen from last time, and this was really due to data revisions from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, was that the wage levels for Indiana, really mostly back in 2016, their estimates of that were lowered, and so we have to take those as a given, as they come out. So that just really kind of lowered the bar moving forward, and so I know that kind of shifted things a bit in terms of the outlook, for the overall level of, wage disbursements in the state of Indiana. And so I'll just put that out there that wasn't me, that was the Department of Commerce, and we have to go with that. And that was a change. Every once in a while, a revision, it depends on the nature of the revision. Sometimes, one quarter will get revised down and we expect it to bounce back if it was some kind of transitory issue. That's not what this was. We see this more as just a bit of a lowering of the level. So the overall employment growth rate was slightly higher in the state of Indiana. A lot of that came from manufacturing. Most of the other sectors were very much as we were expecting. So again, just kind of graph this out a little bit. This gets kind of skewed by the scale gets skewed by the one observation there quite a bit, probably related to agriculture or something. But basically, just the trend in the state output growth, just outpacing payrolls, which is the blue line. So just kind of moving forward. As you get toward the outer years, I will point out that we do see some of those lines going down, and that doesn't reflect any particular weakness or problem that we foresee. It's a lot more just where we will be at that point in the economic cycle, the economic recovery, particularly getting very close to full employment. And so I just want to make that clear that doesn't reflect any kind of weakness or anything like that.
Thank you. Does the GSP include just manufacturing kind of jobs, or does it also include service industry jobs?
It's everything.
It's everything?
Yes.
So if that's the case, I want to ask you, the growth outpaces the payroll, and then you say indicating higher productivity. Couldn't it also be the case that you just have more lower wage jobs? Or how do we know that that's not?
Well, that's probably not the best way to put it. I mean, productivity, basically that's just how productivity broadly is defined, it's just total output divided by, total number of jobs. So it could be all kind of things, but that's just a very broad measure of productivity. And it certainly varies sector by sector, what productivity growth is. Yeah, and it can be a change in the mix of employment. It can be more hours worked, that kind of thing, yes. I'll move fairly, well, actually, I'll go through this a little bit. Won't read through all the numbers here. Again, as we look out a little bit further, I know that's a little bit outside of the immediate budget cycle. But as we get out a little bit, we do look at a little bit of drawdown in payroll employment in particular. Now, a thing that I will point out then is that we see wage income growth remaining relatively strong, and that indicates really what what we've been waiting for a while, which is growth in basically wages per job, average annual wage per job. And some of that can be more hours worked. Some of that can be that's really where your productivity growth gets reflected into paychecks to a large extent. And that's partly a reflection of just increasing competition for fewer workers, and just various measures. But I do want to say, point out that we do see wage income growing, and that's really what a lot of your tax base is. There is your wage income. Down at the bottom, I'll point out housing starts. That's something that we haven't been as worried about probably as we were a few years ago. So I try to make sure and get back to looking at housing starts. Still looking at some room for growth in housing starts. Probably been a little bit of a mystery that those haven't come along a little more rapidly than they have. There's some potential explanations for that, but again, we just see that as really housing starts keeping up with housing demand. In many areas, relatively low stocks of housing. And so we still see that really working through that. So that's just kind of the broad brush numbers and a lot of what we work with the state on. Again, I'll go very quickly through this. Again, mostly just showing that in general, job growth in the state tends to be lower than the national level. Basically what I'll say there is it's mostly related to trends in population growth. It's not, doesn't reflect any fundamental weakness in the state of Indiana's economy or anything like that. It's more just that you kind of have fewer people relative to other states, so that's going to, and really this is a very common picture across most of the states in this tier of the country. But still, we see, a gradual decline, again, as we're just getting closer and closer to full employment out there. And again, this is the higher wage scenario that I mentioned already. This just kind of puts some numbers to it. And in this case, we really see Indiana being mostly a lot closer in line with the United States. Probably in the short run, I think the preponderance of manufacturing jobs help to push Indiana above the national line there in a couple of quarters, but overall looking really pretty close. This just kind of taking a look sector by sector a little bit. This is again just kind of recapping what we saw over the last 12 months. So there's a little bit of problems in using these monthly numbers. They can be a little bit volatile. I will say that there aren't too many states for which we see manufacturing being the biggest number, particularly in terms of number of jobs, maybe on percentage growth basis. So that's really just a reflection of just the composition of the state's industry mix. Healthcare and social services has always been a big job provider, and we certainly see that continuing. Construction has finally come back a little more than, it's probably been a little slower to come back than we expected. Some of the numbers on the negative side are not a surprise. Others, I know one thing that we drew a question about a while back is the information sector. Has been showing, that's been showing in a lot of states. So that's one thing I'll put out there. Another thing that I'll say is that in some other census, a little more thorough survey work that is done indicates that number will probably be revised upward. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll go to a positive, but we think that a lot of those reported losses are really overstated. Transportation and warehousing has been a little bit of a mystery. I think that must just be more of a
Thank you. Indiana did quite a change in infrastructure expenditure, that would not be in that transportation category. It'd be more in the construction category, would it not?
Yes.
Okay. Would also some of that, do you think, be under state and local government? And you don't have a split between what's local government and what's state government.
In terms of construction jobs?
Well, I mean, if we give money to county highway departments,
No.
whether they increase the number of employees or things like that.
I mean, really, as I look at the breakout of construction jobs, that's normally mostly residential construction, still just in terms of number of jobs, you know, kind of more at the margin in terms of changes in jobs, certainly, you know, infrastructure, you know, commercial projects, and that all can be. I know there's been a lot of times, and I went through this many times with the state of Pennsylvania, actually, where they had passed a big transportation bill a few years ago and really didn't move the needle on, you know, total construction jobs as much as they were expecting. And again, you know, I think the jobs, you know, there were jobs created by that, but it was just offset by weakness in jobs created in residential. But so it reflects all of it.
Senator Italian?
Thank you. I'm a little bit confused by this. Can you tell me, are you lowering the wage disbursements numbers, percentages, compared to what you had in April? I was under the impression you were lowering that by a percentage or by a couple points.
Well, the level in especially 2016 and the first part of 2017 was lowered. So then the growth rates from that are largely the same, but it's just growing from a lower base in 2016 and early 2017.
So you're not lowering those projections for 18 and 19? Or you are?
The growth rates
Yeah.
are about the same as what they were. I don't remember if they're exactly the same. I know they're very similar. But still, the total wage disbursements then will be lower in 2018 and 19 because the base was lower from the previous years.
All right. So let me just ask you this. We've had a good period of low unemployment, good jobs. And as that labor market diminishes, you expect wages to go up considerably. Why are we not seeing that?
That's a good question.
Okay.
I was trying to avoid saying that. That question has been asked a lot. I mean, really, we've been blamed. You know, I'll go back to another topic we talked about earlier, which is productivity. Basically, that wages and productivity should increase. You know, basically in line. You know, as workers are more productive, you know, they're generating more for their employers or for themselves. That'll be reflected in their wages. Really, it's been blamed on low productivity. That could just be another way of saying we don't really know. You know, but you know that I think that is a lot of it. You know, another thing that has been going on, and this is a very credible phenomenon, or you know, credible explanation, is that again we're talking about kind of the average over everybody. Right, so part of what's going on is, especially now that we have the baby boomer contingent retiring, and they're being replaced by you know, workers just coming into the workforce. On balance, we expect those new workers to be paid less than the people leaving the workforce through retirement. So that even if, you know, in some cases, you know, folks who basically have the same job may be you know, getting, you know, raises that are above what's indicated, but as you're replacing higher paid people with lower paid people, on average, that will hold down wage growth.
Right, and just so, but that's not reflected in these productivity numbers that you have?
Well, broadly it is. Again, productivity is, we probably should come up with another word, because productivity does you know, when I think productivity, I think exactly what I believe you're thinking, which is more, you know, that you can get more done because, you know, you're well, for some of us that we have a computer available to us, doesn't always work out that way. But you know, or you know, more machinery available. You know, farmers are a perfect example. You know, farmers can get so much more done in a day than you could a generation ago. So that's what I think of with higher productivity. Unfortunately, that's not always what these numbers are saying. This is a much broader measure of the economy. Thank you. Okay. So that's you know, just kind of a snapshot really here of kind of what we've seen in some of the job changes. Again, as we talk about manufacturing, this is always a big one to talk about. And actually this has been a pretty pleasant surprise, probably, you know, relative to what we were thinking maybe a year ago, was really the maintenance of the auto manufacturing jobs. Or, you know, I should more broadly say transportation sector. You know, certainly, you know, we have been expecting that to level off. That's where we are. You know, certainly did seem a risk that vehicle sales would come back more than that, or would fall more than they have. Especially that light trucks, that light blue line, you know, is very heavily represented in the state of Indiana also, and so that's been a helpful factor there. That just, you know, some of the vehicles that are made a lot in the state of Indiana have been doing well. So that's largely what we've been expecting for a good while. So I'll move ahead one. I do, this is one that I do keep an eye on with respect to demand for light trucks in particular. You know, I think that segment has been helped very much by, you know, the steadiness that we've seen in gasoline, or, you know, motor fuel prices. You know, I should say gasoline and diesel fuel. You know, I should recognize both of those. You know, that certainly is a risk that I think if you get back to where you get a jump up and your gasoline price starts with a 3, that's when I would start to get a little bit worried about light trucks and SUVs, that kind of thing. But we don't really see that happening. So. Again, home building, I won't say much more about it. We do expect that to continue. One point that I've made here before is that really we see single-family homes being a greater part of that mix. That really gives you a bit more economic impact out of that. Basically, just in terms of the jobs required to build the homes as a part of units being part of multifamily units. So you can see more jobs out of that. And then just more stuff that you're putting into the homes, especially furnishings, that kind of thing. So that can be a bit of a boost on that. You know, again, population growth, I mentioned that. Indiana's actually doing relatively well compared to some of its neighbors in that category, but that's just kind of a broad factor that we take a look at. Personal consumption expenditures, probably the main thing to keep an eye on there is just the mix, you know, for the state, especially with the sales tax. You know, in terms of taxable items versus non-taxable items, we do see kind of a long-term shift toward things that tend not to be subject to the sales tax, and we expect a continuation of that. So again, this is mostly just kind of recap of what I already said. You know, again, probably the bigger thing moving forward really is just, you know, state labor force, and as you get closer to full employment, that starts to place limits on economic growth, but we don't see any particular problems. And that's really all I have. Some of the stuff in the back I can certainly answer questions about, but that's stuff that we're generally not that interested in here.
Any questions? Representative Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, you talk about the federal tax bill and the pro-growth for potentially 3 years out there in it. What are things that you would be worried about that might be a negative for the economy going forward? Is there anything out there? Would it be North Korea sending missiles, or would it be a bubble in Bitcoin? What should we watch out for?
Well, you know, Bitcoin's an interesting one. I was just talking with some colleagues the other day about that. In general, I have been viewing Bitcoin as just kind of its own thing. So far, it's mostly been individual investors where, you know, if that whole thing collapses tomorrow, well, that's basically their problem and you know, not a bigger impact. As you start to see funds, you know, if Bitcoin starts to get incorporated into other, you know, investment vehicles, you know, we don't think that's become an issue yet. That's where it would start to get to be a little more of a systemic problem. I don't see that yet. And really the broader issue of the blockchain technology, you know, that's been touted as a promising thing. So even with Bitcoin, part of the question there would be why. If something collapses on that, why? You know, if it's because there's something fundamentally wrong with the technology, that could have implications. You know, certainly North Korea or something really big like that would be, yeah, a low probability, high risk incident. You know, China for years we've kind of worried about, you know, kind of leverage levels in China, you know, whether, you know, they end up having kind of a bad debt problem, that sort of thing. That's probably a little bit more in the realm of a mainstream worry that we still see as fairly low at this point.
Mr. Judich?
Thank you, sir. Tom, quick question on slide 12 on the population growth through 2022. Is that a combination of both? What are the factors in that? Is that taking in out-migration, in-migration, just general Indiana population growth, or is that only looking at the current population and how you see that growing organically?
It's in-migration, out-migration. We look, you know, we estimate domestic migration. We estimate international migration separately. Really, the bigger factor, and one factor that changed for a number of states, not Indiana so much, was changes in the assumptions of the natural rate of growth, basically births minus deaths.
Right.
Indiana, I think, comes out relatively well in that, having a relatively lower average age of the population, so you have a bit higher birth rates. States like Ohio, West Virginia in particular, got hit a lot by some of the changes in, you know, just a lowering of birth rates and a raising of assumed death rates moving forward. That ends up being the bigger factor, and really the state of Indiana does relatively well on that, but, you know, really just kind of the net migration numbers are just certainly not as big as we see in some of the western states. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Brown?
Thank you. Thank you. I had a question. When you talk about full employment, are you defining that as, are those just numbers from the feds? Or are you defining that as those who, you exclude those who are capable of working but are no longer looking for work? Because we're close to it by your numbers, but.
That's another good question. You know, I think one of the interesting things as we look at the unemployment rate, and that's why I don't talk about the unemployment rate a lot right now, is that is a big question in terms of the, you know, this number of people out there that we would expect, you know, could potentially work and aren't showing up in the labor force figures. So yeah, that's certainly one of the wild cards out there, is how many people. I mean, basically there's always someone out there. I don't know that you ever truly get to full employment, and obviously, you know, even when we think we're in periods of full employment, you know, there's always some natural churn out there. And so, you know, as we get out, you know, in further years, I think them, you know, particularly by 2020, I think that by then we do think that, you know, most of the people who basically are going to work, you know, whether you know, they can work and that kind of thing, will be working by then. I mean, we have struggled a bit to understand the especially the proportion of people in that, you know, 25 to 64 age range that are not in the labor force. You know, relative to history, we're kind of struggling to understand exactly why that's happening.
Okay, so I guess I don't understand, why by 2020 do you think those who can work will be working, as opposed to now when we all have particularly manufacturing and service industries in our districts who are desperate for, have help wanted signs everywhere.
Yeah, again, that's another good question. You know, some of what we can see is still just some sorting out, you know, a bit of time lags on training issues that basically then what starts to happen is you start to get people probably moving occupations more than they have been already. You start to reflect that in some of the wage differentials. But yeah, I mean, we already are hearing of issues, certainly in manufacturing, construction, those kind of issues, where people are, you know, where employers are struggling to hire people. But you know, then again, we are seeing you know, payrolls increasing. So it's, you know, it's kind of hard to, you know, it is hard to sort out exactly, you know, what we expect to see with who will be getting jobs.
One more question, quick question, please. So do you see, when you talk about the out-migration of jobs as an ongoing risk factor as well, do you see anything in the proposed federal tax code or anything that we have currently within the state that will encourage repatriation, if you will, of those jobs, if there's been any past out-migration or just future prevention of out-migration?
It's probably more prevention of future out-migration. Yeah, I don't think we see big. You know, one thing I will say, and I hesitate to bring this up because I can't really get very far into this discussion at this point, is certainly one big issue out of the proposed changes in the tax policy, as I understand them, is the elimination of the state and local tax deductions. To me, that's one where, as you know, as from what I've looked at the numbers, the state of Indiana would make out relatively well on that. You know, so that could help kind of in general. Now, you know, what a big impact that will be, I don't know. But in terms of out-migration of jobs, you know, that we see that as a bit more as a future, you know, looking to the future. And really some of that too is, you know, some of the things, you know, we still have some wild cards with some trade agreements out there that we don't know what's going to happen there. And that's certainly another issue that we're watching.
Senator Taylor?
Thank you. Right. Just one question about the slide on page 7, which is the Indiana wage growth versus United States wage growth.
Yeah.
What is your, two questions. One is we see looks like fourth quarter 2017, a huge downward shift in the wages. And then you had forecast that over, so first of all, what was that? I don't get that, but the other piece is you forecasted a significant increase in the first quarter of next year in wages. Am I correct on that?
Yeah.
And what is that attributed to?
A lot of that is just, you know, it can really be fairly minor changes in the mix of employment, particularly in things like manufacturing and construction. You know, I think part of the decline that you're referring to basically is just a little bit of a payback from that big jump in the prior quarter, or, you know, a couple of quarters prior there. So it's just, you know, a little bit of an evening out, and that's all. Again, those are, you know, just that can be some fairly minor changes in the mix of jobs that are coming on quarter to quarter.
So you see higher wage employment in the first quarter, new employment.
Yeah.
And then
and part of that, you know, is just in line with what we're expecting at the U.S. level also. And so it's, you know, a good bit of that ends up being just, you know, the mix of jobs that we expect quarter to quarter, just how that changes.
Okay, so the mix in the fourth quarter 2017, which caused the decline, would then be counter to the 2008 report. So okay, because I'm just in, and then the continued increase, what is that? What do you attribute that to?
That is more, as we're talking, really just employers needing to work harder to, either pull laborers off the sidelines or compete with each other as we get closer to full employment. We really see that as just, there's work out there to be done. There's demand for goods. There's demand for services. And, we basically just see then employers upping the ante a bit to get the workers that they need to get the work done.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Reynolds, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Reynolds, fiscal analyst for the Senate Republican Caucus, and with me is Bill Weinman, Assistant Director for the Division of Tax and Revenue with the State Budget Agency. I'm here today on behalf of the Revenue Forecast Technical Committee to update the committee on the revenue update from our April forecast. As you're all aware, Indiana operates underneath a consensus forecast process. The way this process works is we have a revenue forecast technical committee, which is made up of the four caucuses of the General Assembly, the State Budget Agency, and then we have a econometric expert with us, Dr. John Mikesell from IU. And so those members, you can see in that middle box there, make up the Revenue Forecast Technical Committee. In addition to those members, last April, we brought on as an advisor as well Dr. Dagny Falk from Ball State University. The purpose of that technical committee is to select the equations that are used in order to make the actual forecast of the revenue. Those equations then receive the forecasted variables that are forecasted by ISH Market, who Mr. Jackson just kind of walked through the basis of that. So essentially, the way this works is we select the equations, and then the variables are put into the equations. It delivers a result, and that becomes the revenue forecast that I'll be presenting today. And then we are also, I can't express enough thanks for the help and assistance that we get from the staff of the Budget Agency and the Legislative Services Agency. Those are the people that really do the hard work behind the scenes to put all of this together. And I forgot one other thing before I move on. I also want to recognize special public recognition to the gentleman next to me, Bill Weinman. He is retiring in June, and so he's been with us. He stuck it out for a couple of years, but we're very happy to have him during the last couple of years, and very pleased that he's able to move on, and wish him all the best. So as I said, the committee's task is to review the April forecast. And the first thing that the committee does is we look at the performance and how the equations worked and how the revenues are holding up against what we did in April. And so as we looked at the revenues through November, we saw that sales tax is 0.1% above the April forecast, 2.4% above the same period last year. Income tax was 0.1% below April forecast, 2.8% above the same period in fiscal 17. Corporate tax was 66% below the forecast and 58% below the same period in fiscal year 17, for a total general fund impact of 2.5% below the April forecast, 0.2% above the same period fiscal year 17. As Mr. Jackson just presented to you, the economic forecast continues to move forward, although slightly lower than where we were in April, the expectations of April. So it's still a positive forecast, but yet just slightly below where we were in April. I will remind the committee as well that we are approaching nearly a decade of expansion growth. And so when the next recession is anybody's best guess, but this forecast does not in any way predict when the next recession may occur. The revenue forecast that we will be getting to shortly continues to include and recognize the legislative changes that have been made over time. So to remind the committee, the forecast includes the individual income tax rate reductions that were passed a few years ago, the ongoing corporate tax rate reductions and the FIT rate reductions. It incorporates the changes to the gasoline use tax distribution of the state general fund of the past couple of years, and most recently, last year's House Bill 1002 and the changes there on the impacts to general fund are now incorporated into this December update. So as I said earlier, the main job of the Revenue Technical Committee is to select the equations that we are going to use. And as the committee debated this, we decided to make no changes to the equations that we are using in this December update. And so to remind the committee, sales tax, we are splitting. We have two equations that we work on. We first predict the gasoline use tax, and then we predict the sales and use tax net of the gasoline use tax and combine the two to make the sales tax estimate. On personal income, we actually have three equations that we estimate individually: estimated tax payments, withholdings, and then reconciliations. And then in the corporate, we made no changes to those equations as well. Now, having said that, we did not change the equations for corporate. However, we did make some adjustments to recognize some of the recent losses that we're experiencing through November. So to that point, we made some adjustments to the forecast on these three items. First off, on the corporate income tax, we essentially made three adjustments to the results of the equation. First was on the screen, it's identified here as the IT6 withholding transfers. A couple of years ago, the General Assembly changed the process and at the request of the Department of Revenue and the tax-paying community, and they requested that corporations on pass-through income, that corporations are able to pay those estimated payments in the aggregate for all the individuals that income would be passed through to. We granted that, and from that process, those estimated payments are initially deposited into corporate income, and then when the returns are processed, excuse me, when the returns are processed by revenue, the revenues are transferred out of corporate into individual. When the committee, along with Department of Revenue and the budget agency, when we were trying to figure out what was going on with corporate income and why were we missing targets so much, this was one of the areas where we discovered that there were insufficient dollars being transferred out of corporate into individual over time. And while that doesn't change the bottom line, it's a difference between the corporate income and individual income. So working with the Department of Revenue, we adjusted our base, recognizing all of those transfers that should have occurred, and then use that to forecast going forward. So we have incorporated the correct amount of what should be transferred out of corporate into individual in this forecast, and that has brought down corporate income tax because of that adjustment. Secondly, we recognize or realized or discovered, whichever term you'd like to use, that the EDGE credits versus the historic base are up over where they have been. And if you look back and if you refer back to the legislative tax incentive report that was released this summer, you can see that over the past 2 or 3, excuse me, over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been an uptick on the number of EDGE credits contracts that have been awarded and ultimately certified as well. Keep in mind that an EDGE credit awarded does not necessarily mean an EDGE credit that is certified or claimed. In order to be certified, the agreed upon jobs have to be created and the wages have to hit the certain target. And so we recognized in looking at the data that the amount of EDGE credits that were being claimed by corporations were up relative to our historic base. And so we made an adjustment to our estimates to recognize that increased level of EDGE credits. And then the third item in corporate income is a recognition of an increased level of refunds that are currently happening in our revenues that we're seeing right now. And the committee attributes that to 2 main things. First off is there's been an effort made by the Department of Revenue to be more taxpayer friendly, if you will, with taxpayers and try to move through the existing queue of tax appeals that are out there and to try to move those along and process and get those settled quicker. And so there's been an increased volume of refunds there. Secondly, we noticed that there seems to have been a change in how corporations, whether or not corporations recover. I'm not saying that well. When corporations make estimated payments and they have excess payments over their liability, in years past, a corporation would just carry that forward. Just kind of say, okay, let's just carry that forward. I'll recognize it in a future year. As we dug into the data, what we were finding was that's kind of changed. Corporations are now saying, no, we don't want to carry forward that anymore. We want to take that refund. So there's a dynamic that's changing there, and corporations are actually saying, no, give me my cash now. I think some of that, or I believe the committee believes that some of that is tax planning, if you will, from the standpoint of corporations are seeing that their liability now is probably greater than their liability is later, given what's going on in D.C., Washington, D.C., depending on what the U.S. Congress does. And so I think there's an effort on the part of the corporation to take those credits against a higher liability versus a later liability. In gaming tax, this forecast now for the first time recognizes the opening of the South Bend Tribal Casino. The best information we have is that the casino will open February 1st of 2018. And so we have an adjustment there for the competition that's going to impose upon the Northwest boats. And our third adjustment, which is not on the slide, is interest income, general fund interest income. We adjusted that for 2 reasons. One, to recognize the increase in the interest rates that are currently going on. And in our discussions with the Treasurer's Office, they have made a policy change to where they are going a little bit further out on the yield curve, holding some of their investments a little bit longer in order to try to get better returns. And we were seeing that through 5 months as well. And so those were the 3 main adjustments that the committee made to the forecast. So now what everybody wants to see, they don't want to hear me. So here are by major components, the adjustments to the revenue forecast made by the committee from the April 17 forecast. In sales tax, just a slight change down by $46.1 million in 18 and $48 million in 2019. I'd point out that that's a 0.6% change. I mean, so that's a very minor change to the sales tax as kind of, that's a reflection of the economic variables just being slightly less than what they were in April. They're still positive, but just slightly less than where they were in April. Individual is slightly up in 18 by 26.1 million, and then down in 2019 by 73.6 million. Corporation, as we just talked about, is where the largest reduction is occurring. In 18, this forecast would remove $174.4 million from the corporate income tax projection for fiscal year 18 and $104.1 million in 2019. Gaming taxes, this forecast, while I talked about making an adjustment, those adjusted, it would have otherwise been higher than this, but we brought it down to recognize the South Bend Tribal Casino. So this forecast actually adds $3.5 million in fiscal year 18 and takes away 13.1 in fiscal year 19. All other taxes is 15.4 million up over in 18 and 19.5 million in 2019. And then in total, this revenue forecast would reduce from April $175.5 million in fiscal year 18 and $219.2 million in fiscal year 19. Did I say 19 twice? And then the chart that everyone's kind of used to seeing, the kind of the aggregate composite, if you will, of the fiscal year 17 actual numbers, the April forecast of 18 compared to the updated forecast, and then a difference. I will note in those gray columns, if you will, while this is a reduction to the April forecast, it still is puts us in a growth pattern, if you will. So with this update, we're still expecting revenues to grow overall 0.9% over 2017 actual, and then grow 3.6% in fiscal 19 over 18. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions or make my exit.
Senator Talion.
Thank you. David, I don't have it in front of me, but how many more years do we have for corporate income tax reductions?
You know that off the top of your head. Who? I'm being told it's 2021. We're going down to 4.9 in increments of about 0.25. So it's going to be in 21, 22, somewhere in that range. I just don't have that.
Okay, all right.
Well, we have someone that's telling me that. There we go.
Don't.
Yeah. So after June 30 of 21 is when we will hit the 4.9. So it'll be fiscal year 22.
Okay, and I understand that cut or that loss is already figured into the revenue forecast for every year, so I'm not asking that. But can you give me an approximate dollar amount that each one of those incremental cuts translates to?
I do not have those numbers with me, so I
Okay.
cannot.
All right, thank you.
Senator Taylor.
Thank you. David, going back to page 3, I want to just get a little clarification so that I understand. So where we saw a shift in the income tax, and again, I'm going, when you say income tax, I'm going to assume that's individual.
Individual income,
Okay.
correct.
When we saw the shift from the corporate to the individual, which is what I heard you say, or at least what I interpreted you to say, could that be because of people filing different? Is that, corporations filing as sub-S corporations and then that would be then passed through to their individual income? Is that how,
The IT-6 withholding transfer issue that I was talking about deals with pass-through income to individuals, yes.
Okay, so when we see an increase, because I want to make sure that I state this right. When you go to slide 5 and you talk about a 3.3% increase, right? That's really not that's not an individual income tax increase. That's just a shift in the corporate income tax filings. Am I correct?
Are you, did you say slide 5 and this 3.3?
Yeah, because
That 3.3
I'm
represents
sorry.
the individual
I'm
income
sorry.
tax
You're,
rate that's
you're
in
right.
effect.
Let me go back. I think the wrong slide. I thought there was a slide that where we saw an increase in the individual income tax level. But
That would have been
regardless,
slide 9.
okay. So that being said, the income tax liability that people have today and the increase that we've seen is more, would you say that's more attributed to the IT, the people filing of the IT 6 withholding?
I would not, because on the $5.5 billion base of individual income tax revenue, the IT-6 is really just a blip. It's prevalent in the corporate, because corporate is only, it's $1 billion base. And so it's much noticeable there. It's built into it, but I heard you say, or I heard your question, Senator, is that what's attributable to the growth? It's part of the growth, but I wouldn't say it's a major part of the growth. Because we're taking dollars out of corporate and placing them in the rightful bucket of individual income. Doesn't change the bottom line.
Okay, maybe
We're
you're missing
putting
my
it in
question.
the individual. It's
Maybe-
not changing the bottom line. It's just
Right.
we're getting it in the right bucket.
Well, that's my point. I said growth in the individual income tax level. Forget the overall perspective, the total. The increase that we see in the growth in the individual income tax revenue, can that increase be attributable to the shift in the corporate tax filings? Not the total.
Once again, I would say that a very small piece of the increase in individual is due to the IT-6 withholdings, the growth. Okay, because individual is a much bigger base. So yes, it's part of the growth, but it's not any piece that.
But not the overall growth, David. Maybe I don't even know how to, I guess maybe I'm misstating the question.
It's a function, it's the same equations that we've used in the past. The Global Insight, or IHS Marquette forecast is like this. It's on an upward trend. So what's reflected in the year-over-year growth is a reflection of their forecast of wage disbursements. So that's individual income tax is a function of wage disbursements. And wage disbursements in the global, I keep saying global, it's the IHS Marquette forecast. That has been, and that was the same as in our previous forecast.
Right.
It's going up, and so the equation is going to cause the revenue to go up. Now, as we were trying to explain, why is it down? When IHS Marquette calculates their year-over-year growth, they start with what they receive from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and their starting point went down.
by about 2%.
Okay.
And so,
Okay.
yeah, we went down here, but the growth is still strong. So we're really leveraging off of what the Bureau of Economic Analysis, their revised estimates. And that's what Global then forecasted off of. And if Tom Jackson's still in the room, he can correct me.
No, we don't need to go through that. We don't need to go through that. I don't.
It's still the same growth pattern.
Okay, so my concern is we saw the individual income tax revenue go up, and here's my question. In most cases, you could assume that that would be because we're paying higher wages, right?
Yes.
I mean, if a simple economic analysis is wages go up, shouldn't our revenue, income tax revenue go up as well?
It is.
Right.
Year over year, right.
So, but we saw it go up. Have we seen a corresponding change in the wages go up?
Oh, Tom?
Okay, all right, that's what I wanted to get and to understand. Okay,
Sorry.
okay, not a problem. Again, this is my first time actually reviewing one of these over a fiscal year, so I wanted to make sure I understood it. So thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David or Bill, you mentioned the edge credit and taking into account on the corporate side, a reduction on the corporate. Obviously, edge credit is based on also individuals earning wages and bringing in new income to Indiana. Was there a corresponding increase on the individual income tax side to either offset the loss in the edge or take into account those edge credits coming into play, or was that not factored in?
The underlying assumption, there was not a corresponding dollar for dollar adjustment on the income side, but the underlying assumption was that those dollars wouldn't have been certified by IEDC had those wages and those jobs been met, and therefore those wages and jobs being built into the base already.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't read this last question. On number 4, page 4, you said that there was that we're in a certain cycle, the historical cycle. What is the historical cycle for recessions? I mean, what have we seen in the past?
That's probably a better question.
We are now at 100 months, and the record is 120 months.
90 months?
We're at 100 months.
And the record is?
120.
Okay, but our forecast is still going up.
June of 2019 will break the record.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to make sure, but our forecast is still going up.
We're not projecting a recession. We're not.
Oh, you're not projecting a recession?
No.
Although other recessions have all projected about this time, we start seeing it.
Once again, I mean, our job, with all due respect, Senator, our job as a committee is to select the equations that the economic variables are put into, and those economic variables are supplied by IHS Markit.
Oh, okay.
IHS Markit is not predicting a recession over the 2-year period that we are forecasting.
Nor are they predicting one 4 years out from the, right? Because their chart shows increases all the way through.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
We're there. We're good. We're growing.
All right, I don't see any other questions.
Thank you,
we're
Mr.
good.
Chairman.
So who's doing the Medicaid?
Allison. Is Allison in the hall?
On the hallway? All right, next we'll have Allison Taylor with the Medicaid forecast. All right, if we're ready, Allison.
Okay. Green light is on. So good afternoon, committee members. I am Allison Taylor. I'm Indiana's Medicaid director, and with me I've got Christine Mytelka, who is our contracted actuary through Milliman. And this is, I think, both of our first times here in these capacities, so it's an honor and a pleasure to be here to walk you through the Medicaid forecast as of, well, Christine will tell you, with numbers through September provided to you here today in December. So. Okay, so I am going to start with just some high-level comments, and then we'll have Christine walk you through a handful of slides. But generally, our forecast, you'll find, is really similar to what was presented to you in April. It's updated with actual experience for state fiscal year 17, with a slightly revised forecast for 18 and 19 that Christine will explain the different considerations in terms of enrollment and cost trends that were included to come to revised numbers. So with that said, I'm going to move us to the next slide and let Christine highlight some of our expenditures and funding.
Thank you, Allison. Good afternoon. So on slide 3, you'll see our traditional exhibit of the Medicaid forecast. On the top, we've got the expenditures for the Medicaid program, and the second half of the slide shows the funding. From left to right, fiscal 16, 17, 18, and 19, as Allison said, fiscal 16 and 17 are fully complete at this point, done, final. This forecast is with data through September 30th, 2017, so 3 months into fiscal 18. The rest of fiscal 18 and 19 are projected. The key takeaway, as Allison said, is there's very little change in the appropriations since we last spoke to you in April, and just a slightly favorable, a little bit of a surplus at the bottom. But let me go through everything line by line a little bit to explain a little bit more what this is all about. So on the top, under expenditures, those first 3 lines you'll see are the Healthy Indiana Plan, which is the Hoosier Care Connect and the Hoosier HealthWise, which are our 3 managed care programs. Healthy Indiana Plan covers a little over 400,000 non-disabled adults. Hoosier Care Connect has almost 100,000 disabled adults and children. And Hoosier HealthWise, our largest program, has over 600,000 enrollees, mostly children. Combined, these 3 programs cover over 75% of Medicaid enrollees, which is over 1.1 million of the 1.5 million members that are in the Medicaid program right now, which is about 25% of Indiana's population. The other 20 to 25% of Medicaid members who are not in managed care are in fee-for-service. You keep going down, there's a fee-for-service line, and that shows all the medical service expenditures for the fee-for-service population. Special mention to about 80,000 of our fee-for-service members not only require medical services, but also need long-term services and support from the program. And those come in 2 flavors. About 35,000 of the 80,000 who need long-term services and supports get them through institutional care. So that long-term institutional care line are institutional costs for our members who need those. Mostly nursing facility, but some of the members also are in institutions for the intellectually disabled. The remainder of those that need long-term service and supports get them in the home and the community, mostly through 1915C or home and community-based service waivers, to provide them with the supports they need to continue to live independently in their homes so that they don't need to go to a facility. The next line, Medicare buy-in and clawback. About 200,000 of the Medicaid members are also eligible for Medicare, but very low income. For these members, the Medicaid program pays Medicare for their Part A and Part B premiums, and also for some of them, a Part D clawback payment directly to Medicare, and that's what's in that line. The rebates line is mostly pharmacy rebates. The next line, we remove, most of that is CHIP. We remove about $200 million in CHIP expenditures from our total expenditures because CHIP has a separate appropriation that we deal with just on the side elsewhere. And the other expenditures line is mostly supplemental payments the two largest of which are for nursing facilities, about $1 billion a year, and DISH is disproportionate share hospital payments to our safety net hospitals, about $350 million a year. So in total, the Medicaid program expenditures on a state and federal basis are about $12 billion a year for 18 and 19. Now going down to the funding section, the largest source of funding for this $12 billion is the federal government, which provides over $8 billion of that per year. The next 4 or 5 lines are other sources of income that are not the general fund, and that's mostly provider payments or intergovernmental transfers from other state or county funding. And anything that's not covered by those funding sources is in that next line, which is forecasted Medicaid general fund assistance need. The good news is that that need is just a little bit lower than the appropriation that was provided in April. So we're projecting a $17.8 million surplus for fiscal 18. That's that number at the bottom of that column, and about $28 million for fiscal 19. Part of the fiscal 19 surplus has to do with good news we received on the federal fiscal year 19 FMAP, which gave us about $15 million in surplus.
Okay, and so next we will move on. This forecast really doesn't reflect many policy or program changes, but there are a handful. I just want to walk you through. One, which we expect to see every year, adjustment to the hospital assessment fee. I think committee members know this increases inpatient and outpatient reimbursement in aggregate to the Medicare upper payment limit. And to do this, we use an adjustment factor, and that typically happens in the spring, so we would have just missed it in the April forecast, so we are updating this forecast to reflect those adjustments. And then the other bucket of changes that we're, program changes that we're reflecting in the forecast involve just annual maintenance of our managed care capitation payment rates. So obviously we include the half rate adjustments in there. As was mentioned in the April forecast, we've been working on some inpatient reimbursement adjustments that have now been finalized and are included in this forecast. And then in addition, some final calendar year 2016 adjustments to the rates, which all kind of fold into the general routine adjustments that one might make over the calendar year relating to our managed care rates. And then I'm going to have Christine, and I might add some commentary here and there, but you know, we track enrollment very closely here with the program. So Christine's team has put together a snapshot of where we are, where we think we'll be. Starting off this first slide, as Christine mentioned, we have about 1.1 million in managed care. So we're going to start here and take a look at some of the enrollment trends.
Thank you, Allison. So the first section is the Healthy Indiana Plan, which, as you know, began in February of 2015. So the enrollment for that program grew quite fast through fiscal 16 and 17, but we're projecting it to slow down for fiscal 18 and 19. Most of the groups are following a very similar path. I'll note that HIP, hospital presumptive eligibility, has been coming down, which is actually quite a good thing, as it's probably the most, it's not once there are enough people who have insurance, there's fewer people who are uninsured, then we'll have less need for hospital presumptive eligibility. Hoosier Care Connect is for disabled adults and children. As I've said, that's been pretty stable and very similar to the last forecast. Hoosier HealthWise, our largest program, surprised us a little bit. Compared to the last forecast, there are about 15,000 more Medicaid children and about 10,000 more CHIP children, so maybe about 25,000 more people than we had expected to have.
All right, and then we can move on to next slide is fee for service.
Okay. So on the fee for service, thank you.
Yeah.
On the fee for service slide, those top 2 lines are the people who need long-term care services and supports. So about 35,000 are institutionalized and 45,000 receive services in the community. Those 2 populations combined are expected to grow over the next decade at faster than other Medicaid populations because a lot of it has to do with the aging of the population. What we're trying to do is trying to keep the institutionalized growth lower and try to shift most of the growth into the waiver and state plan populations. No level of care, that's just all the people who don't need long-term services and supports. There's retroactive eligibility here, full dual eligibility, and we also have partial dual eligibility. Those are the people who have have Medicare eligibility as well as Medicaid eligibility. And lastly, limited benefit populations. That's populations that don't get full Medicaid benefits, like the emergency services only population or presumptive eligibility. So those have also been pretty stable from the last forecast.
And that's it for our Medicaid forecast presentation.
Any questions from the committee? Dr. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. It's nice to see a new team, a fresh face. Tell Rob we miss him, right? Is he? Under the fee-for-service, is there any feeling or analysis of how much asset transfer makes people eligible? No. Okay.
We're gonna look at each other and then we'll look into that.
Thank you.
Now, asset transfer, though, does not apply to lots of the ones that are just measured on income now, so it's really only for the aged and disabled populations, but we've not looked into that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Allison, just to make sure on page 3, the 2018 projected surplus and the 2019 projected surplus do not take into account any pending or future state plan amendments to the Medicaid plan. Those could either add to the surplus or detract from the surplus, but those are not accounted for in these numbers, and so we shouldn't take those numbers to the bank yet and assuming any future state plan amendments.
Right, and we do anticipate, I'll be presenting shortly on some policy changes through state plan and waiver amendment process. So yes, thank you.
Representative Porter? All right, Senator Brown?
I may regret that. Thank you very much. You had mentioned in the beginning that our total population is about 25% in the various Medicaid programs. Is that about average to other states, do you know? Or did I hear
It's
you
very
wrong?
similar to other states. It's a little bit more than states that did not implement any kind of expansion for non-disabled adults.
That's the biggest increase? Say that again?
The 25% is very normal for states that do have the ACA, have an expansion for non-disabled adults. Some states have a slightly lower percentage because they don't cover that population.
Okay, so for the non-disabled adults, that's the number that would be significantly different in other states when you're doing a
Some states
comparison? I'm just curious if all these other line items, disabled children, disabled, they're similar across the country demographics, but
They are very similar. States do have choices on how much they want to cover children, for example. Indiana covers children up to 250% of the federal poverty level. Some states go higher and some states go lower, but that's pretty normal. That would, for example, affect the number of children you have in your program.
Okay, thank you. And the rebates and collections, you said it's typically pharmaceuticals. So does that mean that, does the state, through some formulary contract, or is that directly between the recipient, the patient, and the pharmacy, but it's passed through you? How does that work?
The way it works is we have Medicaid claims, like individual claims for every time an enrollee goes to the pharmacy, we have a claim that we pay. And whenever we get all the claims and we take them through our pharmacy benefit manager, which is OptumRx, and they take all of those and find the ones that are for brand name drugs that are eligible for rebates and put together, group them all together for each drug and then submit that to the manufacturer for rebates. So it's all done sort of centrally, whether the person receives their drugs through a managed care company or through fee-for-service, all of the claims come back through OptumRx, and they're the ones that sort of take care of submitting all those invoices to manufacturers for the rebates.
So on our behalf, has the pharmacy benefits manager ahead of time contracted for that rebate, for that discount based on our volume? Or is that just a rebate like those of us who are
okay.
consumers looking at like, oh, I happen to have a rebate this year? No, it's not like that, I assume.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. There's two kinds of rebates. Medicaid gets a very special rebate that's much bigger than most commercial plans do because we get the very best price. And so one entity in each state is allowed to get this top secret document that shows what the best price is. And OptumRx does that for us. So, you know, if there's a particular brand name drug, they figure out what the best price is, and that changes every month. And then whenever we buy that drug, if we pay more than the absolute best price, they get a rebate from the manufacturer for the difference.
Okay, that's what I thought it was. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I do. Thank you. And one quick question. With your forecast, does this take into account of the waiver that you asked for CMS? Is that, does this include the waiver?
So the waiver is, the 1115 waiver that we are seeking approval for CMS is actually on the agenda for shortly after. So I'm going to present that in the state plan and waiver component. And then when we do a revised forecast, we'll incorporate those fiscals into this document. So no, it is not in this forecast.
Okay.
I just got a clarification.
Senator Taylor.
Yes. Can you explain for me under the funding on page 3, the HIP 2.0 has a funding growth in fiscal year 2018 of 46.5%. Does that a combination of the federal funds plus the state funds, or are those just state funds?
I'm sorry, funding growth,
For HIP 2.0 and the 46.
So you've separated out federal funds to HIP 2.0. Can you explain first of all, why does the HIP 2.0 funding include the federal portion?
No, that's funding from, that's special funding for the state side to pay for the.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure. So can you tell me why your forecast changed, so significantly?
Yeah, it does have to do with, as you may have guessed from the federal funding for the expansion population. I think you sort of alluded to that. So through the end of calendar year 16, the federal government paid 100% of costs for the expansion population.
Right.
And so half of federal fiscal year 17 was fully paid for by the federal government. And then it dropped down to 95%.
Okay.
So, and state fiscal year 18 was half at 95 and half at 94. So there's a very big difference between, half at 100, basically paying nothing for half the year and then paying 5%. And then during state fiscal year 18, for half the year we paid 5% and half the year we paid 6%. So that's a very big difference in terms of the non-federal share that had to be paid.
Right. But if I just do simple math and I take 5% of 170 million, which is 100%, right? Right?
So the 170 million,
That's 100%. That would be 100% federal, right?
it was 100% federal at that time, yes.
So if I do simple math and I just take 5% of that, right?
It's a little bit tricky because because the 150 million that was paid at a time when there was a 0% federal share. So that's sort of a base cost for. There are other costs built in aside from the expansion population there. One of them is this line also pays for the increase to physician reimbursement that was implemented at the time at February 1st, 2015 when HIP 2.0 went into implementation. Okay. So a lot of this base cost of $150 million just has to do with the physician reimbursement. I think there might be, I don't remember if there's administrative costs in there a little bit, and just a few small items that are sort of a base level. And then on top of that, when we went to when we switched from the 100% to the 95%, we just added an extra cost on top of that.
Now, was that our decision? Is that part of, and I really don't know the answer to this, was that part of our decision not to accept the federal, if we had accepted the expansion through the ACA, would it still be 100%?
No, everybody's 100%.
Everybody goes down to, okay.
We
all
are
right.
actually getting the expansion federal share. It's just that it stopped for everybody the 100% stopped at the end of 2016 and went to
Okay.
95.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you, Committee.
All right, we're going to take a 5-minute recess. All right, we're back in order here. The first thing we want to look at is the minutes of the last meeting. They've been distributed. Are there any amendments to the minutes?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of the October minutes.
All in favor?
Aye.
The proposed agenda has been placed, distributed to all members and released to the public. Are there any amendments to the proposed agenda? Senator Talion.
Out for a moment. I think that in view of the report that we have received from DCS, and in view of the, I guess it's imminent resignation of Judge Mary Bonaventura, I think that it's incumbent upon this committee to take a look at what is going on with DCS budget. For the past two budget cycles in 15 and 17, we have included additional money for operating administration, for salaries, and I think we need to take a look at what's going on there. So I would propose, and I would like to make a motion that we add to the agenda that we have another meeting in January where we could take a look at this. And since this was Representative Porter's motion, I'm sure he'd like to speak.
Representative Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quite sure the senator hit it right on the head. I think at this point, what's transpiring with the Division of Child Services, that we need to know what's going on. You know, when you read articles and read letters or 4-page letters, I think that's pretty important to us as an agency. So when the appropriate time is there, I like to second that motion, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Is there any other discussion?
Mr. Chairman, questions for both Senator Talion and Representative Porter. So you anticipate, I mean, today is December 18th, that we'd have it by the end of January during the busy part of the legislative session. We have committee report deadlines last week of January. We have the holidays. We have Martin Luther King holiday. We have State of the State. We have State of the Judiciary. Is that when you're proposing that we have a formalized finding as opposed to summer study committee?
I know where you're getting with it. What I would propose is at the discretion. Hopefully, it has been done in January before. It was done in 2012. Before we had a budget committee, you know, during that time. So there has been a precedent set before that this has happened. And so without your enumeration of 5 or 6 points, my answer is yes.
If I can respond, I think it was 2011. But I certainly understand that January of a short session is a really tough time. If we need to move it to the first week of February, that's, you know, after the first week of committee reports are due. I just think that we should hear from DCS about whatever their budget problems are before summer study committee and before we get out of session.
I guess I sympathize with and understand that information is key, and I agree with you. Information will be very helpful in this topic because it does seem like we're all floundering a little bit about information because we added quite a bit of money in the budget, and we also looked at the issue even in the interim in 16 because the crisis was developing at that time. though, again, it's going to be an issue that will have to be developed with the next budget. So I think we have plenty of time to do this. We have the committee process of the General Assembly, Family and Children Committee, as well as Ways and Means on the House side, Senate Appropriations on the Senate side, as well as Health and Provider Services. So I guess I would say let's work through the process and see what kind of information we get over the intervening 2 to 3 months. I don't know if I'd be in favor of calling a special meeting just for it when we still may not have all the information. So thank you.
So Representative Porter, Senator Tallien, what if I would commit to put it on a future agenda at a budget meeting, which I don't know when our next official budget meeting will be, instead of having a special one in January, what if I commit to having it on our agenda for the next scheduled budget meeting? Senator Tallien?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Do we meet again will we meet again in April? Is there a forecast update in April? No. So our next meeting will not be until sometime in summer? All right, here's my concern, and it's my understanding, and again, I don't have all the facts right now, but there are some contracts that may be due to expire with the providers who do child support. And if that happens, and we back off on some of those, we could have a real mess. So I think somebody needs to report to us, like, and I just, Ryan, I think that's a great idea. I just hate to put it off till next June.
But if the contracts expire, us meeting wouldn't have anything to do with those contracts, would they? Wouldn't, I would think DCS would renew a contract regardless of when we meet for these. I mean, we've never addressed that in the past. Mr. Dudich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to update the committee, the State Budget Agency has been working with Department of Child Services on their budget and have been having monthly meetings with them to review their overall spending and where it aligns with their budget. So we are sitting down with them on a monthly basis to understand where their needs are, where the overall budget is, and where efficiencies can be created. So some of the things we've been working on that you'll see today as part of the state plan amendments are collaborations between FSSA and DCS to try to shift some of the cost off to Medicaid. That hasn't been done before, so we are working with both those agencies to identify opportunities where Medicaid can cover those costs, where historically the state has been paying 100%. We are reviewing contracts. We're looking for efficiencies. We have identified savings opportunities within the department that are redundant services. And so for the last probably 7 or 8 months, Senator Tallien and Representative Porter, we've been working with the Department of Child Services, one, to identify additional funding that was included in the budget for 2018 and 19, the $200 million over the biennium, as well as living within that budget and trying to find efficiencies that can be reinvested back into the agency. In terms of the contracts, I can say that as of today, I haven't heard anything of DCS canceling a contract that would put the child support system or the child support program in jeopardy. But as Senator Mitchell mentioned, I'm happy to, as part of the budget agency's role, prepare and work with the budget committee to provide some type of update to the budget committee when they meet next in order to provide the committee with an update on where DCS's finances stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I applaud your efforts. I am concerned when I hear Madam Secretary talks about loss of lives and families being ruined. When we talk about the system somewhat failing, do we really want to put it down 3 or 4 months down the road in regards to a 4-page letter that was written from the Secretary? This is nothing from my perspective. I mean, I don't know about the people on the top row, but from my perspective, I don't think this is something that we push down to, June or July or even May. I mean, I think that, you know, that's nice that you're having those conversations, and I applaud you for having those conversations. But I'm talking about someone that's leaving by the end of this month, and then wondering what was going to happen upon their departure and our children. This is real. This is, you know, this is real. And for us to sit here and try to figure out a way not to do it is very hurtful to me.
Any other discussion? Representative.
Yeah, Representative Porter, appreciate your thoughts. I guess the concern I have is in October of this year, the director did not have the level of concern that was outlined in the newspaper article. So, I mean, these are basically some allegations that are coming forward because the presentation in a newspaper article in October was much different than the presentation that was just presented today. So that's why I think there needs to be more investigation. You're exactly right. We don't have the information, and to do it haphazardly, I think needs the full process to move forward. I think we let the committee process work, we let budget agency come together, and we do this in a very thoughtful manner. You know, hearing it in March or April would not change any of that, I believe.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Senator Talion.
I would amend my motion to cancel the word January and to say, and to request that we have this meeting on this as soon as possible, and certainly, you know, within 30 days of the end of session. Would that make things more amenable to people?
My question, but that would still say 30. I mean, if we get out March 15th, that means we're still looking at April. Within 30 days, we're gone. What can we really do as this legislative branch of government? And so, I mean, I think something needs to be.
Representative Porter, I'm not sure this committee really would have the authority
trying to make
pass
sure that-
something anyway. I mean, what if I commit to having it on the agenda at our next scheduled budget meeting, which at the calendar may be April? I'm asking kind of March or April? And I commit to put it on the agenda at that time. And by then we'd have probably somebody in the office. Senator Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have I haven't been fully briefed on this, but I do know one thing. We keep saying we can't do anything because it's a non-budget year. I think that's inaccurate. The statute actually presumes that we have the option, actually. We've done fiscal matters in the interim sections before, and I've been part of those discussions. I think it would only be appropriate to actually have it during the session so that if we do find something, that we could do it. If we go in April, this is just my thought, what if we find something that's a red herring? Then we have to wait until the next General Assembly, where Doc Brown's going to be busy putting together a budget, one of the best budgets I've ever seen in my life, that I will vote no for. Yeah. I'd like to, so anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I think it would only be appropriate to meet during the session so that if there is something that comes up, that's just my thought, because I'm confused. I'm still confused how we keep allocating more money and then we leave and less money is going to the department, or there's efficiencies that are found after we've put and nothing against finding them. I think that's great. But I think the timing that we need, if we find something, is only during the General Assembly, and I think that's why I believe the best time would be during the session, to hear what is going on so that we can actually make public policy decisions during that time period. Otherwise, we're going to delay it another 7 or 8 months if we come up with an idea and a concept, if we wait till April. Just is my opinion.
Representative Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to reiterate. I'm just looking for some information. I'm seeking information, not seeking any legislation. Okay, let's don't get it twisted, as the kids would say, that I'm trying to project something that isn't there. If you haven't seen the letter, you need to read the letter. 4 pages, and if you want to put it off till April, or May or June, I mean, whatever happens is going to lie with us in general, but it's going to lie on certain individuals, because I'm just seeking information about what was transpiring in DCS. That's all I'm trying to do. I think it's important. And I hope that other individuals who understand will see it as something important.
I haven't read the actual letter. I've heard about it, but I have met with a couple DCS workers, and I get a different story, and I'm trying to kind of put all this together. So I have met with some local DCS workers and get a different story than what I've heard. But I have not physically, personally read the letter. But I'm just trying to commit. I mean, obviously there's an issue, and I'm trying to commit to putting it on the agenda at a future date, at our very next budget meeting. So Senator Taylor, Senator Talion, you have a motion, and you've kind of modified it a little bit. So how does your motion stand now?
This is really difficult because, I really do want the committee to come to a consensus on this. But I also really do understand the importance that maybe we get this information during session. So I think I'm going to make the motion, Mr. Chair, that we have a special meeting sometime before session ends, sometime, in January or February. And that's the motion that I'll make.
So we have a motion to meet during session.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I guess we'll call the roll. We'll start with Representative Brown.
No.
Representative Porter. Senator Talion.
No.
Mr. Dudich.
No.
And I vote no as well. But with that being said, I will commit Senator Talion to have something on our first scheduled budget meeting. All right. All right. All right, the agenda is placed on the table for discussion. All right, so if we, do you have something you want to say? No. So I see Secretary Lawson, if we're, I know you have a commitment, and so we'll kind of take you out of order here and.
Oh, thank you. I'm here today to request your permission to participate in social media videos that my office creates to educate Hoosiers. As a statewide elected official, the Indiana Code 42615 requires that I offer a compelling public policy reason to do so, and also to receive this committee's approval. Accordingly, I'm here today to explain the request and to request your approval to make an appearance. I, like many of you, use social media to disseminate information to the public. And as, excuse me, as social media grows, the methods and the ways to deliver content on these platforms has evolved. So currently, many platforms are going to more video-based content, such as Facebook Live and Insta Stories. While there is nothing in statute preventing a state office holder from using social media, I'm requesting permission from the Budget Committee to place videos on social media. The videos that we develop serve as a tool for the office to alert Hoosiers of potential scams, new features available on InBiz, the state's growing business one-stop portal, approaching deadlines such as registering to vote, and policy changes such as the new notary law taking effect in January. Our goal is to disseminate information quickly and in an engaging and educational manner to ensure that Hoosiers are up to date on what they need to know. I believe there is a compelling public policy reason to communicate with the public via social media, and more specifically, social media videos. Social media has become an integral part of how we disseminate messages to constituents and the media about changing policies, upcoming deadlines, and official activities. It has become the way that many Hoosiers get news. So I ask that you grant my request today so that my office can continue to stay relevant on social media platforms and to deliver content to the public in the format that's demanded. I thank you for your time and consideration, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Secretary Lawson? Senator Tallien.
Thank you. I don't have a question. I just have a comment because this very day, the Senate Democrat Caucus Chair, meaning me, just asked permission to do the very same thing with our, what we call our media mail money, to be able to divert some of that to social media and the internet. You're right. It's time, and I'm going to use your very arguments to bolster my presentation to David Long. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I do have a question. I really don't see this as the same thing, unlike my colleague. Secretary Lawson, you being a former member of the Indiana General Assembly, I think you understand this, but I believe IC 42615 was devised, and correct me if I'm wrong, or the rules change came up during your predecessor's term. Am I correct? Not White, but Rakita. Did
I
we make
believe it came up during Secretary Rakita's term, yes.
And didn't we make this change because we didn't want him using social media?
I don't know the intent that anyone made the change, but it does not apply to social media. And the reason I'm here today is because the way you communicate on social media has changed.
agree.
Because people, even though it's social media, they don't want to take the time to read it. They want to watch a YouTube video or something like that.
Let me just give you a hypothetical, if I could. Here's the commercial.
I'm sorry?
Here's the commercial. The commercial is, we just changed the way you get your driver's license, or we just changed what ID you have to get. And this is a public service announcement that tells you you can get your new driver's license at the BMV. Brought to you by your Secretary of State, Connie Lawson. Is that an advertisement, or is that what you're talking about doing here? Or is it more of, this is a posting or a video that tells you that you need to get your license and this is how you do it, and there's no tag?
And
That's
there's no
just a
what?
There's no tag.
There's no
Brought to you
tag?
by your Secretary of State,
No,
Connie
that,
Less.
that would be done on a campaign site. This is official business.
Okay.
So for an example.
Okay.
On January 1st, we have 95,000 notaries in the state of Indiana whose requirements are going to be changing. And so it would be nice if I could get on and say, you know, as your secretary, I want to remind you that here's what you need to do to be compliant on January 1. We have another new business law that you all passed last session that also takes effect January 1. And so there's new filing requirements on our InBiz program. So those are the things that we're thinking about doing. You did give me permission. I came to Bloomington and you gave me permission to do a documentary on financial literacy that we have shown across the state for senior citizens. I'm in it, but there's no tagline. See what I'm saying? And it identifies me in the video as it does other participants, victims of financial crime, my securities commissioner, and other folks. I'm identified, but we're not using a tagline. This is for official messages so that our constituents can understand what they need to do to be compliant.
I have no problem with the use of social media. I think it's actually almost compelling that every department do so. My only concern, again, is this is going back to my years back when we were talking about the office being used as some form of, and I don't think, let me say this, there's no way I would attribute that to you.
Well,
I want to
make
go
a
on the
point,
record as
Senator?
saying that.
I think the one important point here is that I think one of the reasons the General Assembly passed that bill was because there were some state dollars being used.
Okay.
This doesn't cost any money. You know, this is as simple as taking a video from an iPhone and posting a message on social media. You know, we're not going to be using state dollars to do this. We're not going to be placing ads on social media. We're going to be putting information on social media.
Man, that begs the question, why can't you do it now?
Because they're in the Indiana code that you mentioned, there is information, or there is language regarding videos. And we just wanted to make sure that we were okay to do a social media video. The law does not address social media because social media was not a thing when the bill was passed.
Okay. All right.
Any questions from the committee? Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate you taking the time.
Next, we have the Indiana State Museum, Kathy Ferre.
To an opportunity for us to take the Indiana Historic Site, the T.C. Seal site. T.C. Seal was one of the most prolific artists of his time. He's been recognized internationally. And at that site currently, we are unable to serve our visitors in a manner by which that it would allow that audience to grow. We are looking to expand those visitor experiences by adding restrooms and an opportunity to host additional programs and rental facilities so that we can help move that program forward so that it becomes more sustainable rather than simply stable. We also have a member of the public who feels that this site is very important to the Midwest and to the United States and has offered to match our dollars, dollar for the $1 million we're talking about, so that we are able to produce a $2 million project utilizing $1 million of the state's dollars and $1 million of this individual's dollars.
Any questions from the committee? Lost my notes here. All right, Senator Taylor?
Yeah. Are you going to post his name on the building? I'm serious about
Yeah,
that.
no, we are in
because-
conversation with how they'll be recognized, but their name will not be on the building as such that it's their building.
No, I'm talking about the TC Steel.
TC, oh, yes, sorry, I thought you meant the donor.
No, I want to talk about TC Steel.
TC Steel, yes, it would be the TC Steel Visitor Center.
And it will be posted TC Steel.
Yes.
All right.
Any other questions? Mr. Dudich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment. Thank you for bringing the project forward and appreciate the donor gift. Oftentimes we see university projects with donor gifts being associated with the overall cost of the project, but a historic site that has a donor in Indiana who's willing to support that as well as match dollar for dollar what the state's putting in is a good sign and a positive move on this project. So appreciate the State Museum's work on, one, getting that donor and overall bringing the project towards us.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Taylor?
I like this project, but I just want to make one comment about our historical sites, and I think it would only be appropriate to make it right now. That the TC Steel story is something that I think our children, if they don't learn that story, our children are going to lose a lot. And I can tell you as an adult, I didn't learn about TC Steel until I was an adult. And I don't know if anybody from DOE is here, but we need to get that story out. We need to make sure that all the kids in the state know about who TC Steel is. And second, this visitor center and historical site center needs some other things. Hopefully you will, like, when you do this renovation, that we'll start seeing a better collaboration for these historic sites to have, more diverse people in them. You know what I mean? I don't know how to say it other than that. And we need to make a better effort at doing that. I like what you're doing here, but those two things I think is very, very. Those two things I think are very, very important. And I think it's a good project.
Thank you, and we would agree with both of those comments full-heartedly.
All right, thank you. Next is Ivy Tech.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Mary Jane Michalak with Ivy Tech Community College. I'm here today to request the approval of $3 million for Ivy Tech's Community College's Fort Wayne campus, which you may recall visiting back in October. It's for Harshman Hall. Harshman was one of the college's priorities during the last legislative session. It was behind 3 other critical needs, including our Kokomo and Muncie facilities, which you did approve. Thank you. The General Assembly did provide additional funds in the state budget bill to help with critical repairs for the building, which include mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. The building was originally constructed in 1965, was part of a state training facility and a state developmental hospital before it was given to Ivy Tech in 2007. The diversity goal for the Harshman project is 15%, which is based on market feedback for a project of this size and scope in Fort Wayne. And Ivy Tech generally uses efforts to increase participation of minority, women-owned, and veteran business owners, including outreach events, bid packages created to encourage diverse prime and subcontractor adequate bid opportunities. Prime contractors are encouraged to solicit bids and work with diverse subcontractors and vendors. We follow a public bid process, and the college's procurement officers distribute information about XBE solicitation. For comparison, we're aiming at a 20% for each of the Kokomo and Muncie projects and have tied financial impact related to exceeding the goals for our construction management partners. I appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Tony Hahn with Purdue University. I have two projects for your consideration today. The first is our Veterinary Medicine Teaching Hospital Phase 1. By way of background, Purdue operates a full-service large and small animal veterinarian hospital, which also serves as our teaching hospital for our College of Vet Medicine. The current hospital was built in 1959 and is currently separated into large animal and small animal. We served 20,000 cases in the hospital last year of different animals, as well as 60,000 visits to animals were visited on farms by one of our 6 ambulances. This phase 1 construction would include approximately 77,000 gross square feet of a large animal and equine hospital that would have a separate entrance for biosecurity reasons relative to the existing hospital. It would contain a large animal surgery suite, large animal exam and diagnostic equipment, large animal and equine treatment, medicine ward, and an ICU. This is phase 1 of 2. The second phase would include the small animal hospital as well as the food animal hospital. This would help us meet potential accreditation issues and also create the appropriate separation of teaching hospital facilities and species for biosecurity concerns, as well as maintain safe spaces for the students to work around the large animals. It's a $35 million project, $5 million of which would come from gift funds and 30 from reserves held at Purdue. Any questions about the hospital?
Questions for Tony? Mr. Dudich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tony, of the 76,600 gross square feet being added, is there any reduction of square footage because of this phase of the project?
Relative to the current hospital?
Yes, so are you going to demolish something? Are you going to reuse that? Just kind of wondering the general change in the footprint. Once this is done, what's the existing facility look like, or does that go offline?
The existing facility that this replaces, which is the large animal and equine portion, is the portion of the current hospital in the most need, and it was built in 1959. And we've determined that it's lived its useful life, and it will be demolished. That portion will. Where the small animal hospital is in the current hospital, when it is replaced, that will turn into lab space and teaching space for the College of Vet Medicine. So there will be new construction of large, small, and food animal in 3 separate facilities, and the existing facility that is now a hospital either will be about half demolished and then the rest converted to research and teaching labs, which are much needed for the college.
Any other questions? All right, thanks, Tony.
The second project for your consideration is also within the College of Vet Medicine in their Lynn Hall. This is an HVAC renovation project that would install new heating, ventilation, and air conditioning that would serve the basement and the ground floor of the small animal and the basic science area of Lynn Hall. It increases the hot water capacity as well as some of the airflow in the anatomy lab and other labs where you want good airflow. The estimated cost is $2.3 million, and it comes from two separate funds. $1.6 million comes from the state appropriation R&R that is appropriated every year by the formula, and $700,000 comes from university funds where we internally allocate funds for R&R projects. Any questions about the Lynn Hall HVAC project?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so first one, well, we already did certificate. So for the review items, the next one, we already did Secretary of State, so now Department of Education. Melissa?
Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Blossom, and I am the Assistant Director of Secondary in the PK-16 Division of the Department of Education. We are requesting approval for 11 school districts that have identified students in need of an alternative education setting. These new programs will assist students in finding academic success while supporting students with necessary wraparound services, specifically access to highly qualified teachers, counselors, social workers, and employers. I have had the privilege of conducting site visits at each of the locations over the last months. During each visit, districts presented the required documentation, provided me with a tour of their facility, and allowed me the opportunity to interact with teachers, administrators, counselors, and students. All 11 districts have met the program qualification as well as those required by statute. Thank you for your consideration.
Any questions? Representative Brown?
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. It looks like quite a diverse group of school corporations that are taking advantage of this. Do you know the funding? Are they using it within existing funding? Are they getting any specific foundation that's giving grants? How are they starting to develop these programs?
Okay, so they are already actually operating based on their current budget, so this would just either supplement or add to existing programs. So they are already have students enrolled in the programs.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Ready? Hi, again, Allison Taylor, Indiana Medicaid Director. I have a couple, actually several review items for the committee today, presenting you with a couple of state plan amendments and then waivers, and I will run through those with you really quickly. As Director Dudich noted earlier, the first two state plan amendments that we're presenting today involve our ongoing partnership with DCS to identify ways to streamline our Medicaid spend and just do what's best for parents and families and children across the state. So in that spirit, the first one is Hoosier HealthWise hip transfer, and that is just the general concept that we're working with DCS to identify a single vendor to deliver managed care services for children and youth on a statewide basis. So the purpose there is really to better coordinate care. We've seen this done in several states with really great outcomes, and it really allows the single statewide health provider to managed care provider to develop a long-term relationship with the child and really improve access and quality and ensure there's no gaps. So that is the first item that we're presenting, and it does, the fiscal impact, let's see, page 2 of 13, over time definitely will be savings. Just taking a look, okay, for 19. So over time, we expect this to result in savings to DCS while, again, benefiting the children. The other program or policy change that we're here to talk about is a change to the way that we reimburse our psychiatric residential treatment facilities. We call those PRTFs. You'll see that term a lot. And this doesn't impact members or the children. It really is just incorporating some, approaches within Medicaid to help DCS maximize and leverage the opportunity to get federal funds and federal assistance. So this would change the rate for PRTFs to a facility-specific rate instead of statewide. And again, in bringing Medicaid into the picture allows us to collaborate and allows them to draw down funds that they would have otherwise spent 100% state funds on. So it's a win-win there as well. And then if there aren't any questions, I can move on. We've got a handful of, we'll move to the waiver side of the house. you're going to see three or four waiver items that we are seeking to address. The waivers are assist Medicaid in allowing us to provide person-centered care in the home instead of in the facility or institution. And so some general themes that you'll see in the tweaks that we're making, we're adjusting reimbursement because a lot of these waivers are actually at their natural renewal period. So along with the renewal goes a look at cost and update there, but also identifying themes of helping with provider capacity, access, promoting continuity and integration, aligning case management definitions, and general compliance with the federal home and community-based settings regulations that we are actively bringing our agency into compliance with. So we'll start with the Children's Mental Health Wraparound, CMHW waiver. That's with our sister division of mental health and addiction. And this waiver basically just renews with a slight rate increase based on cost studies. And DMHA is confident this will help address provider capacity and access issues. Slight fiscal impact in 19. And then our Division of Aging Partners within FSSA, they too are seeking renewal of their age, blind, and disabled waiver for a few reasons, but one key factor here is, again, home and community-based settings rule requiring state agencies really across the country to update their policies. So the Division of Aging has undertaken a really thoughtful process to redesign case management and come along with that a slight rate increase to align with federal regulations on person-centered planning. So this is a result in a policy and program initiative that they'll plan to pursue in the future. This one does have a fiscal impact of about $3.24 million in 2019. And then we will continue the tour across our different divisions we've got. Now we'll move to Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services. So DDARS, as we call it, they've got two waivers that, again, provide services in the community. And we are amending both of those. So we can start with CIH, or the Community Integration and Habilitation Waiver. So DDARS, again, after a really thoughtful and engaging process with stakeholders in the industry, are undertaking to revise a definition involving transitional case management, which is the ultimate goal is to help transition folks into the community and not into an institution. Further helps us comply with Olmstead, and there's many reasons for this change, but it will involve a rate increase to go along with the expansion of this transitional case management, again, supported by industry. You can see slight fiscal impact in 2019. Representative Porter's looking at me. And then to complement that, we also have the Family Support Waiver, or FSW, within DDARS as well. This makes some similar changes in that revising case management, increasing rate, but mostly actually to align this with CIH. We had gotten off track in that the rates didn't quite align, and it only makes sense to equalize those. So DDARS is seeking that change to align reimbursement and add annual reimbursement for case management. So again, on that theme of working with the individual, managing their care, really trying to get them into the community, which is the most cost-effective and preferred destination for individuals. That too has a fiscal impact of $1.19 million in 2019. Finally, the last waiver I will mention, this is about the Adult Mental Health Habilitation, AMHH, or Primary Health Care Coordination, BPHC, which are two Division of Mental Health and Addiction waivers. These have no fiscal impact. They are on here, though, because we are, because of the natural timing of things, we have to renew. It's the same rate, same utilization, nothing is changing here, but it is here just for your reference. And then we got, yes.
Thank you. I guess before we got to the last extension, the HIP waiver extension, you kept talking about because the waivers expire and you have to renew and you have to look at cost reports. Are they cost reports to make your reimbursement rates, or do you do a market study of
It's a,
what?
it's a, I think I blurred too. It's a cost study. So, and I'm going to turn around and see if I've got my team. But I can get back to you, but I think it's a cost study
And
that
it's
we have
what
to do with.
costs are allowed by the department?
Yeah, can I get back to you before I?
Okay. I mean, this is, as a provider, maybe I'll put, we want to long-term, think about what are the market rates to deliver the service.
Yeah.
Because access to care, we're hearing more reports about some problems with access to care based on the market rates, not the cost rates.
Yep.
There's a full cost survey done for this waiver for all services.
But it's the cost that you allow. I mean, if I wanted to buy a Segway to be in my cost report, you probably wouldn't allow a Segway to be in there, right?
Yeah, so that's good feedback. Let us check. Christine, our backup team has left, but I do know market. That's important, and I know that we at least have conversations about it. I don't know if it's in the cost survey.
The community integration waiver, you talk about the rates, but is it a equalization of the rates, an average of the rates, or taking the highest rate?
So I believe it's for the family support waiver is where we are aligning with the CIH rate.
I'm sorry, say that again?
So we are taking the, or DDARs, I should say. My understanding is that they are aligning the case management rate structure between CIH and FSA. So that results in a rate increase.
So it's
for
kind
case
of an
management.
average or a median or, okay, thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Dudich?
Sorry, Chairman Brown, I think if I remember correctly from my discussions with Alice and her team, there is the family support waiver, and then there's the CIH waiver, and because the administrative fee, I believe on the CIH waiver is lower than the family services waiver, if I'm getting this right, because the admin fees are different, providers are going to one versus the other, and it's actually costing more on the other waiver. If you normalize the administrative fees on both, it doesn't create this pull towards one waiver. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, that is my understanding.
That's the question. I mean, are we going to pay higher or lower? And, I want to pay lower, but the field wants to have the higher rate.
Right. My understanding is we are bringing it up because we are also, they're fleshing out the case management provision, so it's not a pure financial. I think we're asking more of in addition to the rate. And this is all kind of a comprehensive and coordinated effort to better deliver those services in the community. Yeah. Okay. All right, and so the last item we have before you is the Healthy Indiana Plan 1115 waiver extension. So I will not be presenting everything that's in the waiver today. The purpose here is just to hit some high-level changes that we're making that could potentially have fiscal impacts. And as you're aware, the 1115 HIP waiver, we are seeking approval effective February 1st, 2018 through January 31st, 2021. We're in productive and active conversations with CMS right now at the moment. And we're making lots of improvements. We're really excited. I could talk for an hour, but I wouldn't. But making some administrative improvements. So defining the benefit period as an annual period, and January to December, which just will make more sense for members. It is reflective of the commercial market and adds administrative simplicity. Providers, we've already heard they're very happy with that change. A couple other hand-selected changes that I'll tell you about. We did have our first ever MCE selection period, so again, aligning with commercial market, allowing members in the Healthy Indiana Plan to, at a certain time of year in the fall, pick or have the option of changing health plans. Making improvements for pregnant women so that there's less barrier or hurdles for them so that they can kind of have a seamless interaction from going into that pregnancy category while they're in HIP. And we will allow for a tobacco surcharge to be applied to the power account contribution for members after a year in the program. Ending the HIP link program and changing eligibility for transitional Medicaid assistant or medical assistance, removing the graduated copay, adding chiropractic coverage to HIP Plus, again increasing the value proposition of the Plus program, and expanding Gateway to Work. Now, another offering, so those are all within HIP proper. We are adding, in addition, changes via this 1115 waiver to address the governor's pillar on the opiate epidemic. So expanding inpatient treatment and coverage of residential treatment, those are the two SUD changes that we've identified that will not only be available for HIP members, but all of Medicaid. So we think that is a significant opportunity to really move the needle in this area. So if you take a look at the fiscal then, for 19, we've got about 8.5 million, and most of that is from the SUD changes. So the HIP pieces that I talked about at first, my understanding is that it is, there's very little movement in actual costs because we are making some administrative improvements and it's neck and neck. But because the SUD component is, we're expanding it to all Medicaid, it will have a general fund impact, and that's what's reflected here. And I will note, Gateway to Work, the details of that are still being negotiated with the federal government, and we're not, there's no definitive answer on what the financing will look like or the match rate, so we don't have that in here yet, but as soon as we do, that will be something that we'll work with our partners in budget and make sure that's communicated when we have an understanding. So that is what's in the 1115 at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More of a note than a question, so Allison, you can take a deep breath. For the first two SPAs, as Allison mentioned, as I spoke earlier, this is again indicative of the cooperation between DCS and FSSA. Historically, DCS had not used FSSA and Medicaid as a way to leverage state dollars, and so the first two plan amendments, the Hoosier HealthWise HIP transfer and the psychiatric residence treatment facility, will either A, create efficiencies within the department to allow caseworkers to focus on their cases versus managing where kids are in the medical system and allow for them to utilize their time better. And the other is we're paying 100% state dollars for some of these psychiatric residence treatment facilities services, not all, because some of them are not covered under Medicaid, but some are. And through the cooperation between FSSA and DCS, we're able to, with this state plan amendment, allow for some of those medical costs to be claimed under Medicaid, creating a savings within DCS, and then allowing them to reinvest that within the system. So two examples of how we're working, two agencies working on trying to create efficiencies as well as some savings to reinvest in the program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. You went through it so fast, the tobacco surcharge, what was that you're?
So within the Healthy, it's one of the program features of the Healthy Indiana Plan. And we're seeking approval from the federal government to allow us to charge a tobacco surcharge to those that indicate they smoke on their HIP application.
Which is unique from?
Currently, that is not current practice.
Current and private. Bonus you if you, for example, go to smoking cessation, but we're going to say if you're smoking, it's going to come because
Yeah, so there will be a surcharge, and and my understanding is I do think some commercial do it. I mean, I know we did an analysis on that, so we can definitely have a conversation about that. But yeah, you're right.
Senator Tallien.
Thank you. The HIP, let's see, the Gateway to Work program, it
Yep.
says it's going to be mandatory
Yep.
for certain members, and then you're going to connect them to employment opportunities. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yep, absolutely. So the Gateway to Work program will be a tool or mechanism to kind of connect coverage to all the supports and trainings that aren't available today to get involved in the community. And so we're going to start with the HIP population, right? So we've got, several 100,000 of those members. Then we have, after a kind of a statewide tour in which we went to multiple cities, met with several stakeholders, consumers, got a lot of good feedback on what should we be thinking about in terms of who shouldn't participate in the program. So we have several exemptions: students, medically frail, homeless, caring for young children, participating in TANF, over 60 years old, pregnant women, primary caregiver of dependent child, below compulsory school age. Sorry, I know I'm just rattling things off to you, but kinship caregivers of abused or neglected children, certified temporary illness, including those in FMLA, active SUD treatment, former foster children under the age of 26, recent incarceration. So that's a way of saying, getting to who will participate, not those individuals that we've identified as having good reason to focus on other aspects of their health and well-being. But for those that are, ready to take the next step, we will have a menu of qualifying activities for them to comply with this work requirement component. And it's not going to be just work. So it's going to be work, school, volunteer work, could be volunteering in your kid's classroom, learning English as a second language, caring for elderly non-dependent, job skills training, participation in SNAP work requirements. We anticipate our managed care entities will have very robust kind of life coach and community engagement programs, so that will be an opportunity, community service. So those are all the things that will tick the box of that mandatory participation in the program. Does that help?
That's very vague. I mean, I understand if people, I understand the exemptions, and I understand if people are not working, they might be helped to work, but you did sort of ding a bell with me about mandatory volunteering. What was that?
Well, it's an opportunity to engage in the community. So instead of just taking, it's not just a work requirement. We want to give individuals the opportunity to volunteer, to participate in their kids' school, all of those community engagements that get them ready kind of for that next step. We're going to include that. We want to be inclusive and do what we can to help lift up Hoosiers. So,
is this mandatory that they do this volunteering?
Yeah. If they meet the qualifications, then they'll have these opportunities to participate, and they could choose another.
Well,
they could go to school.
An opportunity to participate is not the same as a mandatory requirement, and so I'm going to be really interested to see exactly what this does.
And we'll continue to flesh out. We're hoping to get approval, and then we have built a nice runway for us to work on implementation. So this is one of the components that won't be effective in 2018. So we're going to start in 2019, and we continue to do do our due diligence and be as thoughtful as possible to make sure we have the right program and the right infrastructure to make sure we're successful, because we want individuals to stay in the program, maintain their health coverage, and gain access to that economic mobility they didn't have before.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you. See you later.
All right, Ryan Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Ryan Vaughn. I'm the president of Indiana Sports Corp. I'm joined here today by William Knox, who's the chair of Sports Indiana. We're here to speak to the annual $550,000 appropriation. The appropriation is actually shared between both of our organizations, so I'll speak to the first part, which relates to the Big Ten, and then sort of our event pipeline. And then William will talk a little bit about the statewide function of Sports Indiana. As it relates to the Big Ten Conference, everything is moving smoothly with our partnership. We just finished our 7th Big Ten football championship. It was a sellout. It was the second most watched college football game all season, just behind the Iron Bowl. We are continue to have that event through 2021 every year. We are also blessed to have the women's basketball tournament every year through 2021, and the men's basketball tournament back here in both 2020 and 2022. One of the benefits of this partnership is that it has actually grown outside of this agreement, and the Big Ten continues to bring events not originally contemplated to Indiana, including both rowing, track and field, and cross country. So that seems to be moving very well. As far as pipeline goes, we've had a pretty exceptional year attracting new major events to town. We were fortunate enough to be awarded the 2022 College Football Playoff National Championship, as well as the 2021 NBA All-Star Weekend. So 4 years from now, in that 13-month period, will be a pretty exceptionally busy place in Indiana. We'll actually play host to the 2021 NBA All-Star Weekend in February, the 2021 Men's Final Four in March, the 2021 Big Ten Football Championship in December, the 2022 College Football Playoff National Championship that following January, and then in March, also the Big Ten Men's Basketball Tournament is back. And that's just to name a few in a 13-month period. So the next 4 years are great. We have a lot of NCAA events teed up, Big Ten relationships teed up. And we're also currently working with both all three, USA Gymnastics, USA Track and Field, and USA Diving on their Olympic trial opportunities for 2020. So.
Yeah, and the second portion of this appropriation is for Sports Indiana, which is a statewide consortium of tourism organizations and sports commissions that have come together to collectively market Indiana as a destination for sports tournaments and events. That portion is $150, which is broken down into two segments. $100,000 of that is used for our sports development grants, which in 2017, this past year, 13 events were awarded throughout 11 communities throughout the state. And we're working with our newly developed statewide economic impact calculator to help develop the scenario by which what economic impact came as a result of those events. In addition to that, we continue to work with all of our communities to do outreach outside of the state. We have a reimbursement program by which our communities statewide can go to national trade shows to not only promote their destination, but also promote the state of Indiana as a destination for sports tourism. So there is no paid staff for this organization. We rely very heavily on our partner in Indiana Sports Corporation to help us facilitate what we do, and we look forward to this continued partnership.
Any questions? Representative Brown.
Thank you, and yes, really excited about all the economic activity, both in Indianapolis and through the whole state, because I see the Ohio Valley down in Evansville. But it seems like maybe a couple mid-conferences, do we have them on our radar screen? The MAC conference plays a lot of their tournaments in Detroit, and I certainly think Indianapolis would be a much fairer city than Detroit. And then also thinking, since Indiana now has probably the most schools in the Missouri Valley, with Valpo being added, should we be making a run at Mid-American and the Valley?
From Sports Indiana's perspective, we work with several other conferences for smaller events statewide, and I'll let Ryan speak to some of those opportunities in the Central Indiana area. But the Horizon League, which is here, and also the GLVC, we've worked very closely with on their event opportunities.
Your comment about Detroit's particularly timely. Their renaissance they're going through is partially driven through a sports strategy, very much like ours was 40 years ago. And they're competing at a high level, but we continue to go after those events outside of sort of the Big Ten, Power 5 conferences. Not only the conferences you mentioned, but the Horizon League now with IUPUI as part of that. I'd love to do more with the Big East, with Butler as part of that as well. And it's not just different Division I conferences that we pursue. We also go across all three divisions. So just this March, we'll play host to the greatest sporting event known to mankind, which is the Division III Swimming and Diving Championship at the IU Auditorium. And so we really kind of we kind of go across all parts of the NCAA and where we can, conferences that have some foothold in Indiana.
Any other questions? Senator Taylor?
Thanks. The list that we have on the back, is that from Indiana Sports or Sports Indiana?
Mhm.
Okay. So when I go through that list, Sports Indiana is the not-for-profit arm of the Sports Corp?
No, they're
Okay.
two standalone organizations.
All right. So, first question, I'm looking at the list of things here, and it looks like you're all over the state. So if it's not Indianapolis, then you're probably the people that handle that. Okay. All right, so that answers that question. And then the Sports Corp, for President Vaughn, the Sports Corp then handles all the other events, right? So you would handle all of the events associated with the Big Ten Championship and things like that here in the city.
The Big Ten championships in the city that tend to use the largest venues. So, for example, we may not be really involved in the cross-country championship, but we would be in the football championship.
Okay. So you do all the work associated with stuff here in the city of Indianapolis, right, Ryan?
Correct.
Okay. So, when one of the things I've been reviewing your website, one of the things is what has been the civic engagement in both of those for both of your corporations? Because I'm trying to get a Jackie Robinson Little League, for example. Let's say is that part of your purview or is that Sports Corp?
That's a Sports Corp part of our mission. So, for example, we have two programs, one called Geared for Health, another called The Exchange. So Geared for Health, we buy or accept new equipment which is donated, and we get about 40,000 pieces of equipment a year, and we give that out statewide. About 130 different youth-serving organizations across the state come and actually physically pick up the equipment in Bankers Life Fieldhouse and take it back. The other is called The Exchange, and that's actually just a kind of a virtual version of what I just explained, is where youth-serving organizations across the state can register online to receive information about either venue availability, needing volunteers, or equipment. We have over 1,500 youth-serving organizations registered on the Exchange, and we push out a lot of equipment and volunteers and coaching opportunities and venue relationships on that as well.
And from Sports Indiana standpoint, we kind of serve as a boots on the ground statewide to help them expand some of those programs. So a lot of our communities take those resources and push them out so that local programs in those areas are aware of these statewide initiatives.
Okay, that's what I noticed. I noticed yours were like in Hamilton County and other, And then we really support. We have an archery. In Hamilton County has an archery competition.
Well, it was actually the national championships for USA Archery, which is a governing body for the sport, and it was hosted in Westfield. Yeah.
I would have liked to have seen that. All right.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. All right, are there any motions to remove any items from the agenda?
Second.
All those in favor of? Say aye. 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 Opposed? Okay. Mr. Dudich?
Yes,
Would you like to say a
Mr.
few words?
Chairman. Just as a notice to those still watching online on the World Wide Web and those here in the room, the Budget Agency with the updated revenue forecast will be posting a surplus statement tomorrow on the website. So look out tomorrow, probably late tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon for an updated surplus statement for 2018, 2019. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Mr. Chair, you're going to continue to work with all members and specifically the minority party to try and arrange when the best timing on the meeting for DCS, because I believe there's a couple other agenda items that are hanging out there also. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct. With that being said, thank you everybody for their patience my first few budget meetings. Wish everybody a Merry Christmas and enjoy the time off with your families, and look forward to seeing everybody after the first of the year. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.